Here's a question. Who is responsible for saving the planet? Or who is responsible for protecting the environment? The government, big companies, or you and me? Imagine your government introduces strict environmental laws. Factories have to reduce pollution. Cars produce fewer emissions. Public transport improves. But millions of people continue to waste energy, use enormous amounts of plastic, and throw away perfectly usable products. Can governments solve the environmental problem on their own? Probably not. But then we have another question. How much responsibility should individuals actually have? And this is exactly the kind of question IELTS likes to ask. Imagine the examiner asks, what can individuals do to protect the environment? You could say, people can recycle, use less plastic, and save energy. Good, clear, correct, but let's develop that answer. Individuals can reduce environmental damage by adopting more sustainable habits, such as reducing waste, conserving energy, and using public transport whenever possible. Now we're getting somewhere. Notice the difference. Use less plastic becomes reduce environmental damage. Save energy becomes conserve energy. And use public transport becomes part of a wider area, adopting more sustainable habits. These are significant upgrades for your IELTS speaking test. The important thing is we're not simply using longer words. We're expressing the ideas more precisely. There are plenty of environmental issues to discuss. Pollution, climate change, plastic waste, destruction of natural habitats, rising temperatures. These problems don't only affect wildlife, they can also affect the human being. It affects our well-being. That's a useful phrase. Well-being means health, happiness, and general quality of life. So instead of saying pollution is bad for people, you could say environmental damage can have serious consequences for human well-being. That's a much more flexible sentence. And you can give an example. For instance, air pollution can contribute to health problems, particularly in heavily populated urban areas. And suddenly, you've turned one simple idea into a developed IELTS argument. Now we get to the real debate. Governments have enormous power. They can introduce environmental legislation. They can invest in renewable energy. They can improve public transport. They can regulate industries. And they can introduce policies designed to reduce carbon emissions. So you could argue governments have a greater responsibility because they have the power to introduce large-scale changes. That's a strong argument. But there's another side. Imagine the government introduces excellent environmental policies, but individuals don't change their behavior. People continue wasting energy. They produce enormous amounts of waste. They refuse to change their habits. The policies may be less effective. So legislation alone is unlikely to solve the problem unless individuals are prepared to adopt more sustainable lifestyles. So perhaps the best answer isn't government or individuals, perhaps it's government and individuals. And that's a very useful strategy in IELTS. So don't make your argument too simple. Here's something important. IELTS questions often appear to give you two opposing choices. For example, who is responsible, governments or individuals? But you don't necessarily have to choose one. You can say, although governments have a crucial role to play, individuals also have a responsibility to change their behavior. That's a concession. You're recognizing the other side of the argument before developing your own position. Another useful expression is, while large-scale government action is essential, individual behaviour also has a significant impact. Now you've created a balanced argument. That's much better than governments are responsible, individuals are not. That answer is much harder to defend. So here's an interesting idea. Environmental problems are enormous. It can be tempting to think, what difference can one person make? If one person turns off a light, does that really matter? If one person uses a reusable shopping bag, does that really make a difference? If one person walks instead of driving, what's the difference? Perhaps one action doesn't make a huge difference, but imagine millions of people making small changes consistently. The combined effect would be significant. And that's a useful phrase for IELTS, have a significant impact. For example, individual actions may seem insignificant, but collectively they can have a significant impact on the environment. That's a much more sophisticated argument than small actions are good. Now, in a writing task, you might see a question such as, some people believe that governments should take full responsibility for protecting the environment. Others believe that individuals should be responsible for reducing environmental damage. Discuss both views and give your opinion. Let's build the answer. Government responsibility. Right. Governments can, as we mentioned, introduce legislation, invest in renewable energy, improve public transport, regulate industries. Individual responsibility, as we mentioned, individuals can reduce waste, conserve energy, use less plastic, adopt sustainable lifestyles. And your opinion? Well, here's one possibility. From my perspective, protecting the environment requires cooperation between governments, businesses, and individuals. That's the position taken in a higher level text. Notice how it's much more nuanced than simply saying everyone is responsible. You've identified who needs to cooperate and why. Let's look at 5 useful IELTS chunks from today. Environmental damage. Governments need to reduce environmental damage. Renewable energy. Investment in renewable energy could reduce carbon emissions. Sustainable lifestyles. Individuals should adopt more sustainable lifestyles. Environmental legislation. Stricter environmental legislation may be necessary and have a significant impact. Small changes can collectively have a significant impact. These aren't simply impressive looking words. They're collocations, words that naturally work together, and that's what makes them useful in IELTS. So, who's responsible for protecting the environment? Governments, businesses, individuals? Perhaps the answer is all three. But there's a bigger question behind this debate, because environmental problems don't stop at a national border. Pollution travels, carbon emissions affect the whole planet, and climate change doesn't care which country produced the emissions. So here's the next question. Should countries be expected to sacrifice economic growth in order to protect the environment? That's where the argument gets much more difficult. And that's exactly where your IELTS English needs to become more sophisticated.